He walked in without a word, asked everyone to leave. 1 hour later, Jeff Bezos walked out, eyes red and hands shaking. The plane landed just after sunset. There were no reporters, no welcome banners, just the dry wind of Burkina Faso and a single black SUV waiting near the tarmac. Jeff Bezos stepped off the jet slowly, his face tight with thought. He wore a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up. No security, no team, just him. The driver didn't speak. He'd only been given one instruction: take the man directly to the presidential office. No detours, no questions. Inside the vehicle, Bezos kept staring out the window. He wasn't looking at anything. Not the trees, not the people. His eyes were locked onto something far away, something not even there. It had taken him 4 years to make this decision. 4 years of silence. 4 years of pretending he didn't need to come. But something inside him had broken last month. And when he broke, he remembered one name: Ibrahim Traoré. That night, he'd typed it into his phone at 3:14 a.m. Just the name. No message, no email. But he stared at it for 20 minutes before locking the screen. Now, he was here. When the SUV rolled up to the presidential building, the guards outside weren't sure what to do. They weren't told he was coming. One of them recognized him, but even then, no one spoke. Bezos stepped out quietly. Inside, Traoré was in a meeting with regional elders. A security officer leaned in and whispered something into his ear. The president paused, blinked twice, and stood up slowly. He didn't say goodbye, just walked out of the room. In the hallway, he saw Bezos waiting by the window. No smile, no expression, just waiting. "Jeff," Traoré said gently, surprised. Bezos didn't respond. He looked directly at him and said 4 words: "Can we talk alone?" Traoré nodded once, motioned for the hallway to clear, and led him down a quiet corridor. No guards followed. They entered a small side room. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a pitcher of water. That was it. Bezos stepped inside. Traoré closed the door softly behind them. For a moment, neither man spoke. Bezos pulled the chair out slowly and sat down. He took a deep breath, but it didn't help. Traoré sat opposite him, watching. Then Bezos looked up and said in a voice that cracked just slightly, "I haven't slept in weeks." Traoré didn't rush him, didn't interrupt, just waited. Bezos leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "There's something I never told anyone," he said quietly. "Not my assistants, not my ex-wife, not my brother, no one." The room was silent. Even the air felt still. "I made a decision once," he continued, "years ago. It seemed small at the time, like just another business call. But it changed a boy's life, and I never saw him again." His voice tightened. He looked away, toward the window. "I don't know why I thought coming here would help. Maybe because you've seen what power does to people. Maybe because you haven't let it destroy you." Traoré's eyes narrowed. Not judgment, just listening. Bezos reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, faded photograph. He slid it across the table, face down. Traoré looked at it, then back at him. "Please," Bezos said. "Just hear me out." Then he looked up, eyes tired, and added, almost in a whisper, "I don't want to die with this still inside me." And that's when he turned the photo over. Traoré picked it up. A young boy, no older than 8, standing barefoot on cracked ground. Behind him, a collapsed shelter. His eyes were wide. Not with fear, but with something far worse. Bezos leaned back in his chair. "That boy lived because I said no," he murmured. "But 10 others didn't. He paused, swallowed hard. And the part one can't forgive is that I didn't even blink. The weight of those words sat between them, heavy as stone. Traoré didn't respond. He folded the photo gently, placed it on the table, and leaned back. A clock ticked in the corner. Then, after nearly a minute of silence, Traoré said something Bezos hadn't expected. "Do you believe in redemption?" Bezos looked up, startled. "I don't know. I'm not asking if you deserve it," Traoré said. "I'm asking if you believe it exists." Bezos didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. "I don't think it does," he said at last. Traoré stood up slowly. He walked to a wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, unlocked it, and took something out. A small, dark box. Hand-carved, African wood, no hinges, just a sliding lid. He placed it on the table in front of Bezos. "What is this?" Bezos asked. "It was given to me by a boy who survived a war," Traoré said. "Inside is something you can't buy, can't replace, and can't forget." Bezos hesitated. Traoré slid the box toward him, and just as Bezos reached for it, fade to black. Bezos stared at the small wooden box on the table. It wasn't fancy, just a simple square with smooth carvings on the side worn down from time. His fingers hovered over it for a moment, unsure. Then slowly, he opened it. Inside, there was no gold, no artifact, no technology, just a folded piece of cloth. It looked like it had been cut from something larger, old, fragile. Bezos carefully took it out. There was something stitched into it, faded, almost invisible. But as he brought it closer, he could make out the word, "Stay." One word, hand-sewn in shaking letters. Not by a machine, not for sale. It was a message, a cry. Bezos blinked, confused. "What is this?" he asked softly. Traoré's voice was calm. "That boy you saw in the picture? His name was Mamadou. His village was bombed when he was 6. He ran alone for 3 days, and when the UN found him, this was tied to his wrist." Bezos looked back down at the cloth. "He'd sewn it himself?" he whispered. "Yes," Traoré replied. "With a needle someone dropped in the rubble." He didn't even know if the letters were right, but he thought if he could write the word, someone would stay. Bezos closed his eyes. The word hit harder than he expected. Stay. The thing he hadn't done. Not then, not ever. He'd moved from room to room, decision to decision, always. Rushing forward, always calculating risk and return. He'd never stayed, not once. And in this tiny, forgotten corner of the world, a boy had sewn one word, begging the world to stop running. Bezos placed the cloth gently on the table, hands trembling again. "I could have helped him," he said. "I remember the email. The request came late, something about redirecting medical drones, but it wasn't profitable. I had bigger priorities." He took a long breath. "Back then, I convinced myself he was just a number." Traoré didn't speak. He didn't need to. Bezos leaned forward. "You know what's worse than guilt?" he said. "Emptiness. The silence that comes after. When you've already done the damage, and there's nothing left to fix." He looked up, eyes sharp but tired. "I built rockets. I built empires. I touched space. And yet I've never been further from peace." Traoré stood quietly, walked to the window, and looked outside. The city lights were few, just a few scattered glows beneath a blanket of night. It was quiet here, slower, honest. "You didn't come here to confess," Traoré said, without turning. "You came here to feel something." Bezos nodded, even though the words stung. "I don't know how to feel anymore," he admitted. There was a pause. Then Traoré turned to face him. "You know what I used to think?" he said. "That power made people blind. But I was wrong. Power doesn't blind, it separates. It puts you in rooms where no one tells you the truth, where no one lets you feel." Bezos looked down again. "I've been in those rooms," he said. "I paid to build them." Silence filled the space again, a silence so thick it could be felt. Then Bezos reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, carefully, he pulled out a small white envelope. It was wrinkled, as if handled too many times. He placed it on the table. Traoré raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "A letter," Bezos said. "I wrote it to myself 5 years ago. I was told by a therapist to seal it and open it the day I felt completely lost. And today is that day." Bezos didn't respond, just nodded. He slid the envelope across the table. Traoré didn't open it. "It's not for me," he said. Bezos gave a sad smile. "No, but I want you to hold it, just for now, because if I take it back, I'll bury it again." Traoré took the envelope, slowly, then tucked it inside his jacket without saying a word. Bezos sat back in his chair. His eyes were heavier now, not with sleep, but with something deeper. "I never thought I'd come here," he said. "I never thought I'd sit across from a man who grew up with nothing and feels smaller than I've ever felt." Traoré walked back to the chair and sat down again. "You're not small," he said softly. "You're just lost." That line hit something inside Bezos. He looked away, eyes glistening but dry. "There was a time," Bezos said slowly, "when I believed I was changing the world." He chuckled bitterly. "I gave speeches, made statements, told the world I cared about progress. But all I really cared about was being remembered." He paused, looked at Traoré. "But now I realize being remembered means nothing if the people who remember you are afraid to say your name." There was a long silence after that. Outside, a single bird called in the night. Then Traoré did something unexpected. He took the cloth, Mamadou's cloth, and placed it gently in front of Bezos. "You can't change the past," he said, "but maybe you can learn to stay, even if just for a moment." Bezos looked at the cloth again, and this time something in him cracked. His shoulders shook, his lips tightened, but no words came out. He looked up, and in the quietest voice, barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't want to be alone anymore." Traoré didn't say anything. He just nodded, then stood up slowly and walked toward the door. Bezos watched him go. But before Traoré could open it, Bezos called out, "Wait." Traoré turned back, and Bezos stood up too. He walked to the table, reached into his bag, and pulled something out. A small silver object. He placed it on the table. Traoré stared at it. A key. Bezos looked him in the eye. "That key opens a vault in Seattle. Inside is something I've never shown anyone. Not press, not board members, not even family." He paused. "If something happens to me, I want you to have it." Traoré didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the key, then slowly nodded once. And in that moment, nothing more needed to be said. Traoré looked at the key in his hand. It was cold, heavier than it looked. Simple, but it didn't feel simple. There was no tag, no symbol, just silence. Bezos stepped back, as if handing it over had taken something from him. He looked smaller now, not in body but in spirit. "That vault," Bezos began, then stopped. He exhaled slowly. "It holds the first drone prototype we built for relief missions. Before Amazon took over, before the investors pulled out, before I walked away from that boy, Traoré said nothing, just listened. Bezos's voice dropped. It also holds the names, the rejected requests, the places we chose not to help. His hand tightened. I kept them all. Every name, every village, every plea. I told myself it was for records, for future strategy. But the truth is, I kept them because I couldn't forget. Traoré looked at the key again. He felt the weight differently now. I want you to have it, Bezos said again. Not to expose me, not to shame me, but maybe to remind me that even the most powerful men should be held accountable. There was a long silence. Then Traoré quietly walked to the table and placed the key down right beside the cloth. That said, stay. He looked up. You're trying, he said gently, and that means something. Bezos swallowed hard. I don't know what to do next, he admitted. I spent my life planning every step. But there's no map for this. Traoré walked to a shelf nearby and pulled out an old photo frame. It was a picture of his mother, smiling, standing outside a hut. The background was blurry, but her eyes were clear. She used to say, Traoré whispered, the only time a man is truly strong is when he's not afraid to kneel. He placed the frame on the table between them. Bezos stared at it. Did she suffer? He asked. Traoré nodded. Once. Yes, but she never let it make her bitter. She believed pain should teach you, not poison you. Bezos looked away. His lips trembled slightly. I don't know if I'm too late, he said. You're not, Traoré replied softly. But the clock is ticking. Bezos let those words sink in. Then, slowly, he walked to the window. The night was still dark, but the first whisper of dawn was starting to touch the horizon. I've stood on the edge of space, he said. Quietly, watched the earth curve below me, felt untouchable. But up there, it felt empty. Just stars and silence. Nothing looking back. He turned to face Traoré. But here, in this room, I finally feel seen. Traoré didn't smile, but his eyes softened. That's because you finally stopped performing, he said. You stopped being Jeff Bezos, the brand, and just became Jeff the man. Bezos walked back to the table, his voice lower now. Do you think I can change? He asked. Traoré looked at him for a long moment. Change isn't a moment, he said. It's a decision, repeated every day. Bezos sat down again. He reached into his wallet and pulled out an old folded paper. It looked even older than the photo. This, he said, was a list I made when I started Amazon. 10 things I wanted to achieve before I turned 60. He opened it. None of them mentioned people. Not one. Just numbers. Revenue goals. Expansion targets. Efficiency. He let it sit in the air. Let it feel as hollow as it was. Today, he continued, I want to start a new list. Traoré raised an eyebrow. And what will you write first? He asked. Bezos looked down, thought for a moment. Then, slowly, he spoke. Make peace with the boy I never stayed for. Traoré leaned back. That's a good start, he said. They sat there in silence again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It felt like something was shifting, healing. Bezos reached for the small cloth again. He held it in his hand, softer this time. This one word, he whispered, means more than all the press releases I've ever written. Then he looked up. What happened to Mamadou? He asked, gently. Traoré paused. A shadow passed through his expression. He grew up in silence, he said. Didn't speak for years. But one day, he picked up a pen and started drawing. Drawing? Bezos asked. Yes. Cities, dreams, places he'd never seen. And one day, he told me, if the world won't stay for me, I'll build one where people never leave." Bezos smiled weakly. "Where is he now?" Traoré answered softly. "He died last year. Malaria. The medicine arrived 2 days late." Bezos' face fell. Traoré continued, "But before he passed, he left behind a notebook filled with his designs. And on the last page, he wrote just one thing." He walked to the cabinet again, pulled out a thin journal, and opened to the final page. He turned it so Bezos could see. One word: home. Bezos stared at it, not as a businessman, not as a public figure, but as a man who'd built everything except a place that felt like that: home. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table again, eyes full now, but calm. "I don't think I've ever had that," he said. "You still can," Traoré replied. Bezos nodded slowly, and then, with no announcement, no ceremony, no headline, he stood up, walked to the door. But before he opened it, he turned back one last time. "I came here for an hour," he said, "but I think I found a lifetime in this room." Traoré nodded once, and Bezos walked out, eyes red, hands shaking. But for the first time in years, his heart was no longer silent. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Jeff Bezos was gone, but inside the quiet room, Traoré remained seated, still staring at the key and the letter Bezos had left behind. The cloth that said "Stay" was folded neatly beside it. Traoré didn't move for a while. He just sat there, hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes distant. Outside, the sun had begun to rise. The light crept in slowly, touching the wood, then the photo of his mother, and finally the silver key lying beside the old envelope. He picked it up again, turned it over in his fingers. This wasn't just metal. It was memory, guilt, trust. A silent cry from a man who had everything except peace. Traoré stood and walked to the window. The city below was slowly waking up. Children in uniforms, mothers carrying buckets, soldiers yawning into the morning light. He looked out and whispered to no one in particular. "Even giants are human." Then he walked back to the table. He opened a drawer and placed the letter inside, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Next to it, he placed Mamadou's cloth, gently, as if it were still alive. And finally, he reached for the notebook the boy had drawn in, the one that ended with the word home. He flipped through the pages, paused, and then smiled just a little. There, on one of Mamadou's drawings, was a small building. 2 chairs inside, a single window. It looked almost exactly like the room they were sitting in now. Traoré closed the book softly. He knew this room would never make headlines. No photo would be released. No press statement would tell the world what had happened here. But something had shifted. A man had walked in empty and left with something real. Not wealth, not forgiveness, but maybe the first step toward becoming whole. If this story moved you in any way, please like the video, subscribe for more stories that matter, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that even the strongest hearts sometimes break in silence. What would you have done if you were in that room with Jeff Bezos? Would you forgive or stay silent? The richest moments in life are the ones no one sees. No cameras, no applause. Just 2 souls finally telling the truth.